All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Policy Analysis. It's good seeing everyone again. It's been quite a while. I guess it's been over a year now, so hope everyone has been healthy and happy. Things have gone as well as it could possibly go, given the current environment, but it is good to see everyone again, and thanks for accommodating this kind of shortened session today. I thought since this is our first class session, we don't have to prolong it too much, but I would like to spend today going over the course syllabus, the assignments that you'll be doing, and then starting off with a brief discussion of some introductory background information that probably a lot of which will be familiar to you, perhaps from your 650 course that you took a while ago. Some information may be new, but to get us all in the same level playing field moving into this course. So I thought that's what we would do today. We'll see how far it takes us, probably a couple hours, and we probably should be able to wrap it up a little bit early today. But welcome back. It's again nice working with everyone and seeing everyone again. Let me share out my screen so we can take a look at the syllabus. Okay. Well, hopefully everyone sees the syllabus there. Thought we'll just run through it. It's been up on the Canvas site for a while now, so hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at it and familiarize yourself a little bit with the class. Again, it's kind of unique that you are having the 640 course now, and I believe earlier in your program you had the 650 course, so there is some overlap between the two. We are trying to make this course unique for you, and so you'll cover some things in a little bit different manner than you covered them in that previous course. So we'll try and kind of keep it fresh and give you some new information. And also, hopefully, in this class, what we'll do is we'll be able to afford you the opportunity to develop some possible solutions to a issue or a societal problem that you may be interested in. That's kind of the whole goal of this course. You know me from our previous course. I always like for you to leave the class with a takeaway. And so you've got something you can take with you when you leave the course. And we'll hopefully be able to do that in this course as well. But we'll talk about that as we go through the syllabus. So we just walk you through the syllabus and the course really quickly. I don't think this will take too terribly long, but just familiarize ourselves with what we're doing, when we're doing it, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it. So you all know me, or you're stuck with me again for another course, so hopefully that's not too terrible for you. You know how to get in touch with me. You know that email is by far the best way to get a hold of me, and so always if you want to set up a time to talk, if you have any questions on anything at all, always shoot me an email. I check my CSUN email at least a couple times a day, so I'll be able to get you a pretty quick response. You know that on my full-time positions at Cal State Long Beach, I'm still there, still doing the same thing I was doing when we had the org theory class together last spring. Still the director of the program and still a professor there. So none of that has changed. Everything is still the same. All that's changed is the way in which we're doing our courses. And I know that in our org theory class, I think that may have been the first course that you transitioned online because of COVID, and you've been doing it online ever since then. So it does look like, I know you can talk to the director of this program about that, but it looks like you're going to be online from now on, at least from the rest of the program. I think CSUN's not moving their MPA courses back on campus until at the earliest, the end of fall semester. So yeah, I want to commend all of you. I know it was difficult that you didn't sign up for an online program, but it kind of the world intervened and you kind of got what you got. And I think it's commendable again that you handled it so well in the org theory course. I'm sure you're going to handle it well again here in policy analysis. You know, we meet on Fridays. I'm sure you've been doing that with all of your courses. I'm not sure in terms of the duration of your courses on Fridays. I would assume probably the length of your course, your class sessions probably depended upon your instructor. I know we kind of took a unique approach to it in org theory because it was your first course that was transitioning online. So I've just kept the schedule that I was given, the 8:30 to 2:30 schedule that we'll adhere to for our remaining weeks. But again, I don't see us going to 2:30 every single day. I think it's kind of tough when you're together for 6 hours and everyone to stay focused and for the material really to sink in well in a 6-hour class session. I don't know how well that actually works. when I was a junior faculty member at Long Beach, one of the first courses I was given was a research methods course. And it was taught during the winter session. And so it was 3 weekends, and we met all day Saturday and Sunday for 3 consecutive weekends. So we met from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. And being a junior faculty member, boy, we started at 8 o'clock, and I made sure we went until 5 o'clock, and that was a huge mistake. And it's tough to get all that information in that period of time. So we'll see how we go each Friday, but I think we'll certainly be done by 2:30. But you know the class sessions, you know the times, so those are all on the syllabus for you. You kind of know what the class is all about. It's your basic public policy analysis course. First part of the course, we'll talk about context and environment of policy, all those basic types of issues. And then in the second part of the class is when we will get into specific policy areas. So we'll devote our attention to education policy and economic policy and welfare policy and healthcare policy, and really look at those unique policy areas individually. Course learning objectives, you can read through those on your own, so I'll leave that up to you. The textbooks for the course, Craft and Furlong, that's a text that I always use in my policy courses. I think it's a pretty good, straightforward textbook. That's going to be the primary textbook that we're using in the course. It's going to guide a lot of our discussions and at least set up for us the parameters within which our discussions on Fridays will occur. It doesn't mean that I'm going to teach from the Craft and Furlong. I'm just going to use it as kind of our template, if you will. Information, as you know, that you get in these class sessions will be somewhat different than what you would get from the textbook, and we'll approach some things in a few different ways. And so you'll get some added value, obviously, by being in these Friday sessions. Then the supplemental book is the practical guide, again, kind of the more nuts and bolts, how do you do policy analysis to go along with the theoretical approach that we get from our main text, Craft and Furlong. Types of assignments that you're going to be doing, again, since we really have a limited schedule here, we don't have all that much time together in the 640 course, I thought that I would try and limit some of the assignments and make them a little bit more realistic, because I know, as I told you in our previous class, I know that you're not only doing this, but you have work obligations, you have family obligations, you've got a lot of things going on, and I'm sympathetic to that because I've been there myself. So I try and keep the assignments as straightforward and as useful as possible. So I don't want you doing a whole lot of busy work just without any utility to it. So the assignments we're going to be using in this course, the first paper, which does roll around relatively quickly, I think we've got this due next Friday, is a very brief assignment. It's only 3 to 5 pages, so it shouldn't take you too terribly long to do this, in which you are going to identify 3 different things for. So in that paper, you're going to identify, most importantly, a societal problem or a societal issue that you want to focus on. So a societal issue could be homelessness among veterans. That could be a societal issue you're focusing on. Perhaps barriers to COVID vaccinations for certain segments of society could be a societal problem that you want to focus on. Maybe the lack of early education, provision of early education for different communities. That could be a societal problem. I want you to think about a societal problem or an issue, and then you're going to use that as the basis for the assignments you're going to be doing in this course. So in this paper, you're going to present to me, here is your societal problem, and tell me a little bit about that problem. You're then going to give me a real brief overview of some of the policies, laws, and ordinances that impact that problem. So, some of the ways we've addressed it in the past with previous policies, previous laws to try and mitigate that problem. But again, this doesn't have to be comprehensive. So I'm not looking for you to give me every single law and every single policy, just kind of a brief overview of what you think are the most important laws and policies that affect this societal issue or problem. And then number 3, give me an idea of some of the stakeholders who are involved in this problem and involved in trying to resolve this problem. Now, you probably know from your 650 course that there are different types of stakeholders and different levels of stakeholders. We can have primary stakeholders, we can have secondary stakeholders, we can have tertiary stakeholders. So what I want you to do is kind of think broadly when you think about stakeholders. So when you're talking about primary stakeholders, The primary stakeholder is going to be someone who gets a direct benefit from the way in which you're trying to solve this problem, or is directly affected by this problem. So if you're looking at the problem of homelessness among veterans, your primary beneficiary of any attempt to solve that problem, your primary stakeholder in that problem, will probably be those homeless vets themselves. And those are your primary types of stakeholders. But then beyond that, you have secondary stakeholders and tertiary stakeholders. So for instance, government employees who will be charged with implementing this policy or implementing a program to address homelessness among vets, those government employees are stakeholders as well, because their job depends upon the success of this program or success of this policy. So kind of think broadly about who are the individuals in the groups who are involved in this problem and trying to resolve this problem. And those are going to be your stakeholders. Now, again, this is your first, in my opinion, this is your first crack at this type of an assignment, this looking at this problem or this issue. So it doesn't have to be comprehensive, but what I would like to see in this paper is, again, a brief description of the problem that you want to focus on, highlight some of the most important policies or laws that affect that problem, and then give me an idea of some of the groups or individuals who are involved or affected by that problem. You'll have a title page. You'll have those three sections: the problem section, current policy section, and stakeholder section. Then you'll have a reference page with any references that you have used, and produce the paper in APA format. Again, very brief, first crack at this, 3 to 5 pages. And that's the first assignment. We're calling it the background problem statement and stakeholders assignment. And I think we have that then due by midnight next Friday. So pretty straightforward type of assignment. Any questions on the background problem statement and stakeholders assignments? I should probably come up with better titles for my assignments. It's kind of a boring title, but it beats paper number 1. So, okay. As you work on it between now and next Friday, again, any questions that emerge, feel free to send me an email. While you're thinking about the societal problem to focus upon, if you want to run some problems past me and kind of get my feedback on whether or not this problem would work well for the paper or for the course, I'm happy to give you feedback on that as well. So feel free to reach out, any questions at all on that first assignment. Then your second paper assignment is this literature review, annotated bibliography, and alternatives development paper. Again, not a great title, but it is what it is. So for this one, what you'll do is you will develop a summary of a literature review with a focus on alternative solutions and evaluation criteria for this societal problem that you are focusing upon. So basically what the paper will be is it will end up being a modified annotated bibliography. Now, in your time in this program, you've probably talked about literature reviews and done literature reviews, and you've probably also done annotated bibliography. So you're probably familiar with the differences between them. But what I want here is I want this to look and feel like an annotated bibliography. And you know, with an annotated bibliography, what you do is you will present your citation for the article or the source that you're going to be annotating, give the citation, and then provide a paragraph or two description and analysis of that source. And then for your next source, you give the citation, then a paragraph or two description and analysis of that source, and so on and so on. So I do want it to kind of look like that annotated bibliography approach, as opposed to a true literature review. You know, in a true literature review, you're not going to be giving your citations and then an annotation. In a true literature review, it's going to be more of a narrative, and you've done these before. And so, you know, you categorize the literature according to major themes. That's much more of a narrative type of analysis. This is a modified annotated bibliography. So for your societal problem, what I'm hoping that you'll do is you will locate a minimum of 6 scholarly sources. Again, the vast majority of these sources will be coming probably from peer-reviewed journal articles. And by this time in the program, you're familiar with how you acquire peer-reviewed journal articles and the difference between a peer-reviewed article versus a non-peer-reviewed article. So your majority of your 6 references will be from peer-reviewed journal articles. Provide me with a title page, then give me a brief review of your societal problem just to refresh my memory about that societal problem that you talked about in the first paper. Then provide me with an idea of some alternatives to your societal problem. So some different ways in which you could address the societal problem, and then provide me with your annotations, your 6 annotations. So it'll be a title page, then brief summary of your societal problem, a brief summary of some possible ways of trying to solve this societal problem. Again, 2 or 3 different ways or alternatives to solving the problem. And then you'll give me your 6 annotations for your sources. That's what we're calling a modified annotated bibliography. So it looks a lot like an annotated bibliography, except it's going to have a summary of your problem and a summary of some possible alternative solutions to that problem. So we're kind of packing that all together into this second paper. So that's your literature review / annotated bibliography and alternatives development assignment. Questions on that one?
You probably discussed this in the beginning about posting the recordings on Canvas, and I probably missed it, but I just wanted to ask that, because that way I can go over what you just said, like, okay, this is what I want. This is how I'm doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I didn't actually mention at the beginning. I'm glad you brought it up. Yes, this session's recording. All sessions will be recorded, and I will post them up on the Canvas site like we did in Org Theory, and I'll do it by week. So as soon as we're done today, I'll go ahead and convert this file over. It usually takes maybe an hour or 2 for me to do that, and then I'll load it up to Canvas. So you can go back and review this at your leisure throughout the week. And we'll do that every single week with every weekly course, every weekly class session. Absolutely. So thank you. That's a good reminder. So they'll all be up there for you to reference. So then you also know you've become familiar with these Canvas essays and using the discussion board feature in Canvas for our asynchronous components to the course. And so just like we did in Org Theory, we're going to do it again here in policy analysis. So you'll have 5 of these Canvas essays. And so as you know, what I do is I will provide for you a prompt in Canvas, so the discussion prompt. You then go in and respond to my initial prompt and then respond to 2 of your classmates. So for each one of these, you'll be doing a total of 3 posts, 1 response to me, and then 2 responses to classmates. The initial response to me is worth 10 points each week. The responses to colleagues will be worth 5 points each, so it adds up to a total of 20 points for each weekly participation with these Canvas essays. I've listed the Canvas essays here in the syllabus for you. Of course, they're also then listed in the Canvas site. The first one you'll be doing, Canvas essay number 1. Please discuss the societal problem you plan to use for your paper assignments in this course. Provide a brief discussion of the problem, where it came from, and some of the stakeholders involved, and then please respond to 2 of your classmates. So those 3 posts, your initial post and your 2 response posts, will be due no later than next Friday by midnight. So you've got that due next Friday as well. Now, the natural question, it's always a good one, is how much do I expect in terms of your initial response to my prompt? You know me from organization theory. I'm a very big believer in parsimony. I'm a very big believer in you saying what you need to say using as few words as possible. You know, we are public administrators, most of us, after all, and so parsimony is a really big thing for us. So what I'm really looking for is a couple of paragraphs I think certainly will be sufficient for your response to my initial post. And then in your responses to your classmates, you know, a paragraph for each response I think would certainly be sufficient. So 2 paragraphs of the response to me, and then 1 paragraph to each of your colleagues. Now, I'm not going to stop reading after 2 paragraphs, and so if it takes you more than that, that's fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm very much interested in quality as opposed to quantity. But just kind of a rule of thumb, usually 2 paragraphs is enough to get the job done for your initial post. The reason why I'm having you do this in Canvas number 1 is that I know next Friday you're going to be telling me about your societal problem in that first paper you're submitting to me. but I think it's good for you to be able to share with the colleagues in your cohort what your societal problem is, and then read what problems they're going to be focusing on. So that kind of gets that discussion going. And so this isn't something new necessarily that you're creating. You can pull this directly from the paper you're turning in next Friday and use that as your Canvas essay, just again to share with your colleagues and get their feedback. We'll just go ahead and look at the other Canvas essays. Then Canvas essay number 2 will ask you to consider the theories presented in class, theories such as elite theory, group theory, institutional theory. Which of these theories are most appropriate for you, for how you will address your societal problem, provide justification for why these theories are appropriate. So we'll be picking just some of those theories that we'll talked about in class and then applying those to your societal problem. Again, initial posts and then responses to 2 colleagues. That one's due in 2 weeks on June 18th. Then Canvas essay number 3, discuss at least one alternative that would properly address your societal problem. Now, in your first paper, you're going to give me, in your second paper, you're going to give me an idea of some possible alternatives. So you've already been giving some thought to that while you're writing that second paper. Here in Canvas number 3, I just want you to pick one of those alternatives that would properly address your societal problem. Explain how that alternative would work and discuss what stakeholders would be involved in implementing that alternative or that solution. That initial response and the 2 responses to colleagues due on June 25th by midnight. Then Canvas essay number 4, discuss 3 alternatives you believe would improve the quality of public K-12 education. Because by the time we get to Canvas number 4, we'll already have begun talking about different distinct policy areas. And one of the policy areas that we'll focus on a little more than some of the others will be education policy. So for number 4, I want to pull out education policy and really focus on that one for Canvas number 4. So here you'll be discussing 3 alternatives that you think could improve the quality of public K-12 education. Explain how these alternatives would work and discuss the stakeholders involved in each. So number 4 looks at education policy and 3 ways in which we can improve public education. Then Canvas essay number 5, your final Canvas essay, please discuss the recommended alternative you've selected to address your social problem. So this is going to come from your final paper assignment, which we'll get to in a second. Discuss why this alternative is the most appropriate for addressing your societal problem. Respond to 2 classmates. That one's due by our last day of class on July 9th. So those are your 5 Canvas essays, the prompts that you will be working on with all the due dates. Then your final assignment, your final paper for this class, which we're just calling the final paper. So again, could have a better title. But you'll be required to develop a 10 to 15 page assignment to combine all the elements of the assignments that you've done before. So your final report will include your revised background, problem statement, and stakeholders paper. So your revised paper number 1. Your revised paper number 2, the literature review, annotated bibliography, alternatives development paper, and then the creation of a new section where you will discuss your chosen alternative, your chosen solution to your societal problem, and a justification for why this chosen alternative or solution is the most appropriate. So not necessarily the best one, because we never really know what the best answer is, but instead we're looking for the most appropriate. So in your mind, this alternative, this solution is the most appropriate solution to that societal problem you've used as a basis for all of your assignments. This final report should consist of a title page. Then you'll have an abstract, again, just like a 1-paragraph abstract about what you're doing in the paper. Then your revised background, problem statement, and stakeholders paper, revised paper number 1. Revised paper number 2, and then your new section on your chosen alternatives or alternative, and then a reference page, all done in APA format. So you're just kind of putting it all together then in this final paper and adding on that section on your chosen alternative. Again, these assignments are scaffolded, and you know me from our previous course, I'm a big believer in scaffolding of assignments. We kind of build toward this final assignment. Then your final paper assignment is your takeaway. So when you leave this class in a few weeks, you'll be able to take this with you and show, this is kind of the policy analysis approach that I used in this course, and show your ability to analyze problems and then develop reasonable solutions to those problems. And I get asked to write a lot of recommendation letters for students as they move on to doctoral programs or move on to higher positions within their organization or move to new organizations. And one of the things I like to be able to put in my recommendation letters is a discussion of the person's ability to identify problems and then come up with resolutions to those problems. And I think that's something that's really useful, not just for organizations, but also for other graduate programs too. That if you have the ability to sit down and analyze a problem, define that problem, know what that problem is about, and then be able to generate reasonable solutions to that problem and select one of those solutions to then implement to solve the problem, I think that's really the very heart of public administration. And so that's what these assignments do, is they get you down the road toward being able to do exactly that. And so that's the whole purpose of these scaffolded assignments. Then, as you know, I like to have presentations. I like for you to be able to share all the hard work you've done throughout the course with your colleagues. And by now, as a cohort, you guys all know each other very, very well. So you're not afraid to share with each other and get each other's feedback. So I also then have this presentation component where you will deliver a brief presentation on July 2nd or July 9th, depending upon how we progress with our schedule. And you'll be doing that here in our Zoom sessions, and your presentation will focus on your societal problem and your approach to solving that societal problem. It's an informal presentation, so nothing to worry too much about. I would recommend you put together a presentation like a PowerPoint or whatever type of program you like to use. Put together that presentation, and then each person will have about 10 minutes or so to then provide their presentation during the Zoom session on either July 2nd or July 9th. You can see how we've distributed the points, trying to make it as clear-cut and as easy as possible. First paper is worth 100 points, second paper is worth 100 points, each Canvas essay worth 20 points, 5 of them for a total of 100 points on the Canvas essays. Your final report paper worth 100 points, presentation 100 points, for a grand total of 500 points for our several weeks together in the course. So yeah, just trying to get everything as organized and understandable as possible. You know how to submit your assignments. We don't have to worry about that. You know my late assignment policy. It's 10% penalty for every 24 hours that a paper is late. If life intervenes, I know life has been intervening a lot over the past year. I truly understand that. It's intervened for me as well. So all you need to do is just let me know in advance. Send me an email, say this has happened. I think I have an extra day or two, and I'll give you that extension and we'll avoid the late penalty. The only time that late penalties get applied is if you don't contact me and I don't know the paper's coming in late. As long as you let me know in advance, then we can waive that late penalty and it's not going to be a problem. One point that is important in terms of the course focus, this is a public policy analysis course. And so you're going to be focusing on a societal issue or a societal problem. I want you to focus on an issue or a problem rather than focusing on a policy as the focus of your assignments. So think in terms of problems and issues rather than a specific policy. Because what you're going to be doing is you're going to be developing a solution to that issue or to that problem. So think about problems that need to be solved or problems that need to be addressed. You're all very much familiar with Canvas, so we're good there. You've been using APA a lot in this program, I would assume, and so you're familiar with APA. You also know my approach to APA is I tell you all the papers need to be in APA format, but I'm not a big stickler in APA, so I'm not going to take points off. We don't have a running head and things like that. As long as it looks and smells and feels like APA, it's close enough to APA for me. And so just kind of get it in that general APA type of format and we'll be fine. Okay, our course schedule today is our first session. Again, we're going to do a truncated session today. We're talking about the syllabus and course overview, and then I will present to you some background foundational information, and we'll have a little discussion about some of that information as well to close out our session this morning. The next week we'll have a full session, institutions, actors, and policy making. And then of course, next Friday by midnight, your first paper is due and your Canvas essay number 1 and responses are due as well. Then on the 18th, we'll do public policy and alternative development and start moving into some specific policy areas such as economic and healthcare policies. Your second Canvas essay and 2 responses will be due on the 18th by midnight. Then the following week on the 25th, we will look at welfare policy, education policy, and environmental policy. That's where you have your second paper assignment due by midnight on the 25th, as well as your Canvas essay and 2 responses. We may or may not finish up that material on the 25th. My guess is probably leaning more toward the may not. And so if we don't get through all that material, that's fine. We can finish up that material on our July 2nd meeting date and then reserve the remainder of the time on July 2nd to get started with our presentations. Canvas essay number 4 and 2 responses are then due on July 2nd by midnight. Then our final day of class is July 9th. We will wrap up all of our remaining presentations. Your final paper, final report is due by midnight, as well as Canvas essay number 5 and 2 responses. So that's our schedule. You're familiar with how quickly these courses go by. Our course is going to go by even more quickly because of the way in which it's structured, in that we don't have all of the Friday sessions that you normally would have in a class like this. And so things are going to go by very, very quickly. But you've been there and done that, and you're all veterans of the program, so you know that very well. All the rest of the policies I'll let you read on your own. They're all the boilerplate that you get in your syllabi pretty much regardless of the class that you take. So you can read through all that at your leisure. I just want to hit on the most important things, what we're going to be covering, when we're going to be covering it, and then of course the assignments that you'll be doing throughout our class together. As you watch this recording throughout the week and as you refresh your memory with the syllabus and the course assignments, if you have any questions about any of this information, any of the assignments, as always, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. If you want to bounce an idea about a societal problem you want to use off of me, you can do that as well, and I'm happy to give you that feedback. Okay, that's the syllabus in the course. Any questions about any of this information up to this point in time? Okay. All right, good deal. Let me stop that share and let's go ahead and share out our material for today. Now what I'd like to do is spend the rest of our time talking about some introductory material, just kind of get us started and get us going with the course. So let me just do a couple things here. Okay, so let's just have a brief discussion about public policy, what public policy is, what public policy analysis is, and kind of the idea of what we're going to be doing in this course, and most importantly, why we are going to be doing it, the purpose of doing what we do in this course. So the big what is of public policy. Now, again, you've had this 650 course, and so you're probably familiar with this, but anybody chime in, what's public policy? When we say public policy, what do we mean? What do we mean by public policy? You can use text chat or the microphone, either way. And what's a policy?
Policy is a law?
Yeah, policy is the law. The genesis of most of our public policies come from laws that are passed by Congress, by a state legislature, could be rules and ordinances, could be ordinances passed by a city council, could be rules that are promulgated by a federal agency or a state agency through the rulemaking process. Those could all be the genesis for our public policies. Now, I think what makes policy is a reasoned and rational response to a problem. Policy is a way to mitigate a problem, a way to address a problem. And it's a way to address a problem that, again, is reasoned and rational, and there is some systemic nature to it in that it's an organized response. So in a lot of MPA programs, you will have courses on public policy, and then you'll also have courses on what's called program evaluation. And some programs will actually combine those two courses together into one. But I think a good place to start with our discussion of policy is to kind of differentiate between what a policy is and what a public program is. When you think about a public policy, you think about it like an umbrella, in that the public policy is the overarching organized response to a problem. The specific ways that we are going to address that problem are then the programs that all fit within that policy umbrella. So say you've got a policy such as you've identified a problem that of at-risk youth, and that we need to try and address some of the downtime that at-risk youth have to try and give them the tools they need in order to be successful. So we want to try and educate at-risk youth. So you've identified that as the focus of your policy. So you have a policy, the overarching policy of the education of at-risk youth. The individual programs that you put in place to help educate at-risk youth are then your public programs. And so you might have a computer literacy program. You might have a after-school counseling program. You may have a mentorship program. All of those programs, the mentorship and the after-school counseling and the computer literacy, are all specific ways that we are going to achieve the overall policy goal of educating at-risk youth. So when you think about policy, think about it as an umbrella that's all connected. It is an organized, systemic way of trying to solve an issue or solve a problem. And yes, these policies, again, come from laws, they come from rules, they come from regulations. So policies are meant to solve problems, which then begs the question, well, then what is a societal or a public problem? And I think when you try and define a societal or public problem, you really get at my favorite answer to everything, which is it depends. And I'm sure I probably told you about this in the org theory. My favorite answer is it depends. My favorite question is, so what? Well, it depends. What is considered a societal problem depends upon the prevailing sense of that society at that time. So a societal problem is an issue that society in general believes needs to be addressed. And sometimes there'll be some issues out there that don't really rise to the level of being considered a societal problem because the majority of society is not that concerned about it. And so therefore there won't be a policy that's developed to address that issue. It's only when that issue rises to the general consciousness of society that, yes, this is something that needs to be addressed, this is something that needs to be taken care of, that we actually put the energy and the effort into creating a policy to address that societal problem. So policy is an organized response or solution or set of solutions to what is considered to be a public or societal problem. How we address these societal problems, the type of policies that we generate, will depend upon how we define or perceive of that problem. Some policies that we generate are what we call redistributive policies. Redistributive policies are the most common type of policy we tend to have in this country. In a redistributive policy, we are solving a problem by taking resources from one segment of society and redirecting those resources to another segment of society. So you think about something such as a social welfare type of program. A social welfare type of program is going to be redistributive in nature, that we are going to take tax revenue that, maybe the majority comes from this segment of society, and we are going to then shift that to another segment of society that needs those resources. On the flip side, think about something like trickle-down economics. That's another example of a redistributive policy. And you're probably familiar with trickle-down economics in the Reagan administration, where you would have tax cuts at the upper income levels, with the idea being that if you cut the taxes for upper income wage earners, Those are the wage earners who then create jobs and create businesses. So if you cut their taxes, they'll have more money to feed back into the economy. More money comes back into the economy, you create more jobs, you create more opportunities for people at lower income levels, and the benefits then trickle down. It's redistributive because the initial benefit goes to upper income individuals, with the idea being that those benefits will then trickle down to lower income individuals over a period of time. But again, it's a redistribution of wealth and resources. Redistributive policies tend to be very controversial, and this is where we argue a lot in the policymaking process, because by definition, some people are going to benefit initially while others will be harmed. And not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but you've probably heard about a Pareto optimal model of decision-making in the past in some of your previous courses. In a Pareto optimal type of model, the idea is that you would support and you would fund a policy that benefits at least one person without harming anyone else. That's what's considered to be Pareto optimal. It benefits at least one person, but does not harm anyone else. Clearly, that doesn't work for a redistributive policy. Redistributive policies, by definition, are non-Pareto optimal. They are suboptimal from a Pareto perspective because someone is going to be harmed. So instead, when we have redistributive policies, we tend to use another decision-making model that's a kind of an economic model known as the Kaldor-Hicks model. Kaldor-Hicks model is a variation on Pareto optimal. So whereas Pareto optimal said that we make decisions and we support policies that benefit at least one person without harming anyone else, in Kaldor-Hicks we say we will support a policy that benefits at least one person as long as those who are harmed will eventually be compensated. So you see the big difference with Pareto and Kaldor-Hicks. In Kaldor-Hicks, we are allowing for some people, at least initially, to be harmed by the policy decisions we are making, but those individuals who are harmed will eventually be compensated for that harm. So when we have redistributive policies, which again makes up probably the majority of the policies we have in this country, we are using a Kaldor-Hicks model as opposed to your normal Pareto optimal model, because some people will be harmed, but eventually, hopefully, they will be compensated. That's the idea with trickle-down economics. And again, we're not going to argue the success or failure of trickle-down economics. That's for an economics course. But that was the idea behind trickle-down economics, in that you're initially not benefiting people at lower economic levels, but over time, as more jobs are created, more businesses are created, the benefits will trickle down the economy. So those are redistributive types of policies. We also have a lot of what we call regulatory policies. Policies that regulate the behavior of corporations, the behavior of individuals, the behavior of groups. We regulate a lot of behavior in our society with our regulatory types of policies. So we have regulatory policies for a variety of reasons, most notably for the environment. And so we'll have regulatory policies that will regulate the amount of pollution that a corporation can create, that type of negative externality. We'll have some regulatory policies where we might want to subsidize the production of a good that may provide good positive consequences to society. And so we'll try and regulate the production of that good through regulatory policies. We want to protect our workers through regulatory policies. We want to regulate food quality and the quality of pharmaceutical medication, the quality of workplace environments, the quality of transportation, so on and so on. And throughout the past 100 to 150 years, we have seen the national government get more and more involved in regulating different types of aspects of the economy and different types of aspects of society. So now we have a lot of regulatory policies to go hand in hand with our redistributive policies. So lots of different types of policies that we deal with. The problem for us as analysts of policies is that, and especially as implementers of policies, is that policies can be very convoluted and very confusing. And they tend to be very convoluted and very confusing because they are promulgated by legislative bodies that have a lot of people from different partisan affiliations. And so whenever Congress or a state legislature makes a law or makes a policy, that policy tends to be unclear. It lacks a lot of clarity and it lacks a whole lot of details. Because if you were to make it very clear and you were to include a lot of details at that formulation level for your policy, there's a very good chance that it won't get passed by that legislative body. In Congress, you got to get 435 people and 100 people in the Senate, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate to agree, at least a majority of those, to agree in order to pass this policy. That's extremely difficult to do. And it's extremely difficult to do in the Senate because of things such as the filibuster. And so you really need to get a supermajority. You have to get at least 60 people in order to break a filibuster and to go ahead and pass that law that will create that public policy. So we tend to get very unclear. We tend to get very vague and ambiguous policies that we as administrators and implementers then need to contend with. We contend with those by writing rules and regulations. And so we then go into the administrative rulemaking process. And those administrative rules that we write will then govern how those policies are to be implemented, who benefits, how they benefit, how much they benefit. A lot of that comes out of that administrative rulemaking process. So we have vague, unclear policies that then have to get clarified through administrative rulemaking. We also know that policies can create both outputs as well as outcomes. And I think this is a really important point, that there is a difference between a policy output and a policy outcome. In a policy output, you are talking about the good or the service that is being produced by that government agency. By contrast, the outcome is the consequence of that output. It's the consequence of the consumption of that good or that service. So the output, again, is what the agency is actually doing. And so if it's an income subsidy program, then the actual checks that are being cut by that agency that go to the recipients, those are the outputs. Those checks are the actual goods that are being produced. Then the outcome, the consequence is, well, what do those checks then mean for the disposable income of those recipients? And so if the disposable income of those recipients goes up, as it likely will, as a result of these checks that they are receiving, then that is the consequence, that is the outcome. So as we study public policy, we need to be concerned both with the output, the actual goods and services being produced as part of the policy process, as well as the outcomes, the actual consequences, to know whether or not our policies are achieving the goals that they were intended to achieve. The policy process is obviously fraught with a lot of conflict. And there's a lot of negotiation that goes on because the policy process itself is all about values, what we value as a society. Do we value education more than we value reducing healthcare disparities? Do we value this policy over this policy? Those are those types of very value-laden debates that we tend to have in the creation and the implementation of public policies. David Easton defines policy for us as being the authoritative allocation of values among a society. So it's a pretty definition, but what does it mean? It's the authoritative allocation of values among a society. The authoritative word really sticks out, and that really jumps out and kind of slaps us in the face. There's a reason why he says it's authoritative. He says it's authoritative because obviously it's coming from government. Now, these are government officials, these are government agencies that are making these public policies. So there's an authoritative type of aspect to a public policy. But it is us allocating values to society. And so if we do value education, say we decide we value K through 12 education more than higher education. Well, that's then going to manifest itself in our public budgets. Then we're going to spend more money on K through 12 education than we will on higher education. If you do any work in education finance, here in California, we have Prop 98. And Prop 98 guarantees a floor of funding, a certain amount of funding, 40% of your general fund, to go to K through 14 education. Higher education doesn't have that same type of guarantee. So we have said we're more interested in guaranteeing this minimum funding level to K through 14 education than we are to higher education. That's allocating values, and that's really an enunciation of where our values lie as a society. That's why when I teach the public budgeting course, which I've been doing for 25 years, I always start out that course by saying a budget is more than just dollars and cents. A budget is a statement of societal priorities. We see which policies we are funding, which policies we are not funding. If we're increasing the funding in a policy area, that shows you that that is a higher value to us as a society than things that we're reducing the funding for. But in public policy, we take a critical analytical approach to studying these policy issues. We analyze these issues to determine what the problem is, and then we develop alternative solutions to those problems. We establish policy goals. We identify who will benefit from these policies that we are promulgating. We come up with ways to implement those policies. We come up with ways to evaluate those policies. We deconstruct those policy areas into their component elements and analyze each of those deconstructed elements. And that is essentially what we do in public policy analysis. But public policies happen within this governing environment. So it's important that we really take a look at some of the different environments and some of the different contexts in which policy making occurs. And so to take it down to its, deconstruct it down to its basic level. Public policies are made within the governing environment. So they're made by elected officials and they are implemented within government agencies, which then begs the question of, well, when we use the word government, how do we know if something is a government or something is not a government? How do we know what's a government versus what is not a government? Any ideas about what's the definition for a government? How do we know a government when we see it? I'm actually going to do this so that I can actually see the chat. So, how do we know a government when we see it? What does a government have that perhaps a corporation does not have that makes it a government compared to a corporation? And there's really one component there that sets a government apart from a corporation.
They have public resources or funding from taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. Their funding sources are much different. For a government to be a government agency, they have their funding sources from the public. And so that then suggests for us heightened transparency requirements, heightened accountability requirements. And getting that money through the form of taxation means that you're getting that money through a form of coercion, that you are coercing residents to provide you these tax sources. That's one of the primary components of a government, is its ability to coerce its citizens. Governments have the ability to coerce citizens to take actions that they otherwise may not take, as opposed to corporations that have much less coercive ability. So if you're a government, you can coerce your citizens to pay taxes. Now, most of us don't like to pay taxes. We like to hold on to as much of our money as we possibly can, and understandably so. But government can coerce us. That if we don't pay our taxes, well, then we can certainly have penalties and fees and interest we have to pay. If we've done it through criminal means, then certainly there can be a criminal type of process that can be issued against us. And so they can coerce you to pay your taxes. Government can coerce you to serve on a jury. You may not want to serve on a jury, but you get that jury notice and you are being coerced to take your time and serve on that jury. So government can do that. In the state of war, where there's a draft, they can coerce people. to join the military and fight in that war. So the coercive power of an organization is really what kind of makes it a government. That coercive power combined with control over a jurisdiction. So if you're looking at defining whether something's a government or not, you look at those two things. Does it have coercive power over its citizens? And does it have control over a specified jurisdiction? If it's got both of those components, then it's probably a government. So these public policies flow out of these governmental organizations. But in our system of politics, they flow out of not only these government organizations, but government organizations at multiple levels. So they come from the federal government, they come from state governments, they come from local governments. There are tens of thousands of local governments in the state of California. And they say in America, and there are thousands in the state of California. I served for 6 years on a local school board, and as part of my duties on that local school board, I was also the president of some JPAs here in California and some local finance authorities. And so we would have local finance authorities that were created from different districts. And so we'd have 2 or 3 districts together in this local finance authority that would go out and issue their own bonds and borrow their own money for their own purposes, in addition to all the different things that the local school districts were doing, in addition to what the cities were doing, in addition to what the counties were doing, and so on and so on. That is our system of federalism. So public policies are made in our unique system of American federalism, which is a sharing of power and authority across different levels of government. Typically at the state and local level, a lot of what you do at the state and local level is what we call direct administration, the direct administration of policies and programs. At the national level, most of the administration of policies and programs nationally tends to be more indirect in nature. So a policy will be created at the national level, and then the implementation of that will then be left to state and local governments. So indirect administration at the national level, they provide the funding, and then direct administration at the state and local level with the actual interfacing and interaction with the beneficiaries, the citizens who benefit from those policies and those programs. Since state and local governments in our system of American federalism have such a role to play in direct administration, over the years they have had a dominant role to play in that they are the ones who are actually doing the implementation. They are the ones who are closest to the citizens. They're on the ground on a daily basis, implementing these policies and these programs. Washington, D.C. is much more removed, and Washington, D.C. is not as much in the loop in terms of the day-to-day functioning of these policies and these programs. So this fragmentation of power and authority has profound implications for our public policies. It's not a situation where the national government can say, here's the policy, state and local governments, you go out there and implement it. State and local government's going to have a lot to say about that policy, what it should look like, what should be included, what should not be included, and how that policy should be implemented. We know from study after study of policy implementation that if you do not have the acquiescence of the implementers of a policy, that policy will never be properly implemented. Pressman Wildowski is a great example from the 1970s, looking at the federal program in Oakland, California, and finding dozens and dozens of barriers that those local administrators were able to put in the way of proper implementation of that policy. So you need to include all levels of government in policy making, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. So our unique system of federalism is something we have to understand and embrace in order to know how to analyze public policies in this country. We also know that policy occurs within this environment of politics. We are swimming in a sea of politics, and politics will affect the policy-making process. When politics intervenes in the policy-making process, politics is all about who gets what, when they get it, how they get it. It's all about that allocation of resources and how actors use resources to get what they want out of the policy process. When policy is done within this political environment, it means that there are electoral types of implications. We always hear the phrase elections matter and that elections have consequences. Well, elections do have consequences. That if you have an election and then one party moves into power, that party is going to bring its policy directives into office. And those policy directives may be completely diametrically opposed to the policy directives of the preceding administration that's going out of office. So it really exerts a very strong influence on how our policies are made and the composition of those policies. And just take a look at the differences between the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration. Take a look at all the policies that the Trump administration tried to unwind out of the Obama administration and to go in a completely different policy direction. Then the Biden administration comes in and the Biden administration starts unwinding those policy directives from the Trump administration. If there's a future Republican administration, they'll probably try and unwind the policy directives of the Biden administration. And we really end up with this ping pong type of effect, where for 4 years we're going down this policy road, or for 8 years, and then the next 4 years we're going down a completely different policy road. And we'll see when we talk about the briefly foreign policy later on in this course, we'll talk about just how complicated that is for nations trying to work with the United States, where they don't know if a new intervening administration is going to bring a completely different policy approach than the preceding administration. Politics also has a lot to do with the incentives and the motivations of those involved in the policymaking process. Political incentives motivate public officials, especially elected officials. We know that elected officials are motivated by their ability to get reelected. There's a very famous study by David Mayhew many, many years ago called Congress, the Electoral Connection. And Mayhew, in his book, made a compelling argument that the primary motivation of a member of Congress is to get reelected, to a new term in office. So how do they do that? Well, according to Mayhew, they do that by engaging in certain types of activities. One thing that members of Congress will do is they will engage in advertising. They will get their name out there. They'll get their name known. They'll get their name in the news, hopefully for positive things, but at least get your name out there. That's advertising, so that people can gain more recognition of their name. If you've ever worked in a campaign, you know that name recognition for your candidate is essential for success. And name recognition is, if you give a voter a list of names of candidates, they can pick out your candidate. They know who your candidate is. They can pick their name out. That's name recognition. That's very important for success in an election. But what is even more important than name recognition is something called name recall. So name recall is, you don't give the voter a list of names. You ask them, who is the Democrat who is running for Congress in this district? If they can give you the name of that candidate or the name of that elected office holder, that person then has what's called name recall with those voters. And that is a very, very powerful resource to have. So they advertise to get their names known. They take positions on very non-controversial issues. So you take a high profile type of position on an issue that everyone agrees with. Very non-controversial. Mom, apple pie, America, those types of issues. It's a process known as minimaxing. You minimize your risks and maximize your benefits by taking high-profile positions on very non-controversial issues. The third and probably most important thing that they do is they engage in credit claiming. They claim credit for things that happened while they were in office. Even if they had very little to do with that thing occurring, they're still going to claim credit for it because that helps them get elected. If you watch legislation as it moves through Congress, when a bill first starts, it may have one or two sponsors. But then once it starts to become more popular and people start to get behind it, you'll see more and more people add their name as co-sponsors. To be a co-sponsor on a piece of legislation, you didn't do anything in writing that legislation. You just append your name to it. You're now a co-sponsor. Why? So you can claim credit for it. So when it passes, that's a very popular piece of legislation. You say, I was a co-sponsor of that legislation. You didn't do anything to write it, but you can still claim credit for it. You do a lot of casework for your constituents because you can then claim credit for helping your constituents solve a problem. Those things, advertising, position taking, credit claiming, are all done for the primary purpose of getting reelected. Those are your political incentives. And so when it comes to making a policy, you're going to attach your name to highly successful policies and policies that are supported by a majority of the public in order to help yourself get reelected. So if a policy makes sense politically for an elected official, they will support that policy, irrespective of perhaps the economic implications or the programmatic implications of that policy. We've had a lot of polarization, obviously, in policymaking between the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats. Republican office holders have their core constituencies, Democratic office holders have their core constituencies, and sometimes never the two shall meet. Two separate core constituencies that they need to serve. When you're serving a core constituency of business leaders versus serving a core constituency of nonprofit organizations, you're going to end up with completely different looking policies to serve those different core constituencies. We've also seen a lot of polarization because of the way in which elections occur. And you've been keeping an eye on the census. You know that we had a census that happened in 2020. There's been a big delay to getting the results of that census, but eventually we'll get those results. And then states will have to sit down and redraw their district boundaries for their congressional districts. Chances are when they redraw those boundaries, we all know they're going to gerrymander the heck out of those boundaries. And so they're going to draw those boundaries to make as many safe districts as possible for their political party. So if it's a democratically controlled state legislature, they're going to try and draw as many safe Democratic districts as they can. Republican state legislature, as many safe Republican districts as they can draw. And that's this process you know as gerrymandering. Gerrymandering can occur with either what's called cracking or packing. A cracking approach to gerrymandering is if you are a Republican and you're redrawing the district boundaries and you see there's a large group of Democrats, a very Democratic area, in the cracking approach, you would then divide that area up into multiple congressional districts. So just a sliver of each of that area goes into different congressional districts, so that the sliver that goes into a congressional district will be a minority of the members of that district. And so you might take that area and include it in 4 or 5 different congressional districts. You're cracking up the power of that political majority. Packing is the opposite, where if you've got that big group of, say, Republicans, then what Democrats will do is they will make that all one district and kind of give up on it. And say, okay, that's going to be a Democratic district. We're going to pack all the Democrats we can into that district and just throw our hands up and say, we're going to lose that one. We're going to win all the rest of them around that district. So that's gerrymandering. Gerrymandering has created these polarized districts. So you have safe Republican districts and safe Democratic districts. So if you're from a safe Republican district, you're an elected official from a safe Republican district, you are going to spend your time working for the interests of your core constituents as opposed to working for everyone's interests. The same thing with the Democrats for their core constituents. So this gerrymandering has really created this polarization in Congress and a polarization in the policymaking process. So public policy really is riddled with politics, and it's done within this type of a political environment. We're certainly not saying that's a good thing. We're saying that's the reality, and that's the way in which policies tend to be made within that type of context. So we're in a public policy analysis class. So the question then becomes, how do we then analyze policies, and for what purpose are we analyzing these policies? What do we mean by analysis? Well, earlier on we said analysis is a deconstruction. When you take something, you deconstruct it into its component elements, and then you analyze, you study each one of those component elements. That's what we tend to do in public policy analysis. We will study the problem and define the problem. We'll study the stakeholders. We'll study the goals of our policies. We'll study how our policies are being implemented, who's involved in the implementation. We'll deconstruct each element of that policy for analysis. McRae and Weil give us a definition of policy analysis as being a rational and reasoned search for the best solution to societal problems. That when we analyze policies, we're doing it to try and find the best solution to that societal problem that we have identified. True, and I think there's a lot of truth to the McRae and Weil definition. The problem with McRae and Weil, though, is their use of this term, the best. As we know, it's difficult for us to ever truly know if we are selecting the best answer or the best solution. Because as Herbert Simon tells us, we have a bounded rationality. We are cognitive human beings, which means we have cognitive limitations. There's only so much information we can acquire and only so much information that we can analyze. So given our cognitive limitations as human beings, there are boundaries to just how rational we can be, what he called bounded rationality. There may be some solutions out there that we never even considered because we never had the resources or the cognitive ability to do so. So to say this is the best solution is really not true. There could be a better solution out there. Instead of a best solution, most of our policy choices tend to be the most appropriate solution. That's why in our assignments for this class, when I ask you to generate alternatives and then select the most appropriate alternative, that's why I'm not saying the best alternative, because there could be a better alternative that we have not even thought of. So we try to select the most appropriate alternative. And that would be my critique of McRae and Weil. This is really the most appropriate as opposed to the best. The policy analysis really does encourage us to take a very critical analytical look at the deconstruction of all the different elements of a public policy. And that's really what public policy analysis really is. Well, if the so what question is still hanging out there, well, so what? Well, then why do we do it? Why do we bother going to all this work of studying public policies? Well, we certainly do it to try and make our policies more efficient and more effective. So policy analysts have this professional concern for public policy, to study it, to try and make it more efficient and more effective. Citizens are oftentimes motivated to study public policies because of what they can get out of those policies. So when professional policy analysts look at policies, they're kind of looking at the nuts and bolts of how the policy was designed, how the policy is being implemented, and how the policy could be better implemented in the future. Citizens, however, tend to look at policies in terms of what they get out of those policies and the outcomes of those policies. So am I getting the result from this policy that I think I should get as a citizen? So analysis done by a professional policy analysis will probably look different than the analysis done by a layperson or by a citizen. But we know that citizens are involved in the policy-making process, and they benefit from that involvement. They benefit from learning more about public policies because it allows them to even better participate and become more active in the policy process. People participate, citizens participate in the policy process in a variety of different ways. One way they can participate in the policy process is through what's called the logic of collective action. And throughout your time in this program, you may have talked about the logic of collective action before. It comes from an author by the name of Mansur Olson from many, many years ago. And Mansur Olson, in his book, The Logic of Collective Action, kind of gave us an idea as to why people join together into groups, why people join together into a collective in order to try and achieve their goals. And according to Mansur Olson, in order for this collective type of effort to begin, you need to have what he calls entrepreneurs. You need to have individuals who are so vested in this issue that they are willing to take on the cost of mobilizing people together and getting people together. And unless you have these entrepreneurs who are willing to get the ball rolling, you're probably not going to have any collective action occur. but you'll have these people, these entrepreneurs, who will bear the cost of getting everything started. They will then attract people to join this collective by providing them with what Olson calls selective incentives. So they'll give them selective incentives to induce them to join into this collective. So a selective incentive for joining into the AARP, if you're over the age of 50, could be you get discounts on insurance, or you get discounts on travel types of offers, and you get an AARP magazine every month. And those are the selective incentives that are used to get you to join and to keep you involved in the organization, and kind of keep everyone together working toward the same goal. That's what was considered to be the logic of collective action. That when you join together, you get the incentives that you want, and by having everyone together, you can then exert more influence in the policy-making process. These collective groups can end up becoming interest groups and can register with Congress and can actually formally start to lobby Congress for their policy goals. And citizens can participate by belonging to these interest groups. Obviously, in states like California, citizens can also actively participate in policymaking through the ballot box, through things like a referendum or an initiative. And as Californians, we're very familiar with referenda and initiatives. A referendum is where the state legislature decides they want to have this decision made at the ballot box. And so in a referendum, the state legislature will place an issue on the ballot and allow people to vote directly on that issue. So, a constitutional amendment, an amendment to the California Constitution, it might be a referendum that has been placed there by the state legislature. That's the state legislature saying, let's let citizens decide this policy. But also here in California, we also have initiatives. And you're familiar with the initiatives process. An initiative is different from a referendum in that an initiative comes from the people. And so this is kind of your Mansur-Olson collective action, in that you'll have entrepreneurs who will go out there and start collecting signatures. If they collect enough signatures to give to the Secretary of State, they can then force an issue onto the ballot. It doesn't come from the state legislature, it comes from these groups of citizens themselves. We saw that with the initiative to recall Governor Newsom. That's percolating along, and now we're starting to see commercials from candidates who want to replace Gavin Newsom. California has an interesting recall type of mechanism whereby recall goes onto the ballot through an initiative, meaning that you got enough signatures to force it on the ballot. But then in a recall election, you not only vote whether or not to recall the incumbent, but at the same time you vote for someone to replace that incumbent. And so you're kind of doing that duality of voting all together in that one recall election. We're now seeing some recall efforts for the district attorney Gasco that have just started as well. But again, those are your avenues for participation in the policymaking process by average ordinary citizens. So citizens participate through a lot of different mechanisms. These mechanisms, according to Morton Grodzins, are what are referred to as multiple cracks. Morton Grodzins, who is a very famous federalism scholar from many years ago, he's most notable for that theory of multiple cracks. His argument is that our system of American democracy and our system of American federalism provides all these different cracks whereby citizens can participate in decision-making and can participate in policy making, participate in the influencing of policy decisions. So people can choose whether or not to take advantage of those cracks, but those cracks are there, whether they be through the logic of collective action, whether they be through these interest groups, whether they be through having multiple levels of government, so that if you have a problem with an issue, you don't just have to go straight to your member of the House or member of the Senate. You can go to your member of the state assembly or the member of the state senate, to your member of city council, to your member of the board of supervisors at the county level, to your school district, you name it. You've got a lot of different avenues for participation. The problem, though, is that a lot of people don't know what those avenues are. And so not knowing what those avenues are makes it more difficult for them to influence policymaking and to participate in the policymaking process. typically those citizens who participate in policymaking are the ones who are well educated on the issue and well educated on the policymaking process. And it ends up kind of being what we call a tautology. It's a tautology in that those who know more about the policy will be more active in policymaking, but the more active you are in the policymaking process, the more you end up knowing about that policy. So it's that vicious cycle, that tautology that tends to happen when it comes to citizen participation in policymaking. But whether you're an elected official or whether you are a citizen participating in the policymaking process, policy is made within all these different environments, all these different contexts that we presented at the outset of our discussion. So let's kind of drill down a little bit more into those different unique environments or contexts of the public policy process. We know that two of the most important contexts or two of the most important environments are the social environment and the economic environment. The state of the social environment, the state of the economic environment will both have impacts upon the resulting public policies that we end up getting. So let's start with the social context or the social environment. When we're talking about the social environment, we know that social conditions are dynamic. That at certain points in time, we'll have more people unemployed, or we'll have more folks who are suffering from homelessness. We may have an increase in wages. We may have a decrease in wages. In a local community, we may have a certain segment of society moving out of that community and another segment moving into that community. So those demographic shifts all contribute to the dynamic social context of policymaking. Now think about a lot of those Rust Belt cities in the 70s and the 80s and really continue on until today. In a lot of those Rust Belt cities, they were hemorrhaging population out of the city into the suburbs and the exurbs, and then eventually down to the warmer states in the south and out to the west. Well, what happens is when you end up losing a lot of your residents, you lose a lot of your tax base. As you lose the tax base, you can then do less in terms of policy. You can provide fewer services to your citizens when you have less revenue coming in. Well, why were they losing tax base? Because those residents who were moving out were the more affluent residents. In order to move out of that inner city, you need to have resources to move out of that inner city. So those who had the resources were your more affluent residents, the ones who were paying more in taxes. So as you lose those residents, your tax base goes down. And the irony, the paradox then, as Paul Peterson would say, is that as you lose your more affluent residents, you lose more of your ability to pay for services, while at the same time the demand for services goes up because of the new demographic profile of that inner city. So just as it's losing its ability to respond to demand, it's getting more and more demands placed upon it by its citizens. So those types of demographic shifts can have a big impact upon policy. Again, I served on a school board, and I can tell you the difference you get from the impact you get from demographic shifts is profound in education. So you have neighborhoods that age. As those neighborhoods age, those children grow up, and you no longer have enough children for that neighborhood school. Well, you're loath to close down that neighborhood school because once you close down that neighborhood school, you know that neighborhood's going to turn over. And then those people will get older in that neighborhood, they'll retire, they'll move someplace else, and then young families will come back in. They will then repopulate that school. And so those demographic shifts really make you think very long and hard about which schools to stay open, which schools to close down. As your population becomes older, they become less likely to support funding for education. And so if you live in an area where you have to have school levies, those levies are probably going to fail if you have an older type of demographic. So demographic changes have big impacts upon the resulting public policies. The economic environment also has a big impact upon the resulting policy that you end up with. Things like unemployment, things like inflation, things like budget deficits will all have impacts upon the nature of your public policies. As your economy weakens at the state or local level, it may mean that you're able to provide fewer services to your citizens. At the national level, sometimes as the economy weakens, you actually do more. and you actually create more policies and you start providing more goods and services. That's what's known as counter-cyclical spending. So the federal government in poor economic times will actually become more active with policies and will be funding more and more policies to try and stimulate the economy to get more money coming into government coffers. And so how you respond to a weak economy will oftentimes depend upon what level of government you're looking at, national versus state or local. We know state and local governments are precluded from running a deficit by their state constitutions. So if your expenditures are outstripping your revenues, you're going to be hard pressed to continue funding these policies because you have to avoid a deficit. Federal government doesn't care about a deficit. Federal government runs deficits and has run a deficit every year except for 2 years since 1969. So, sit back and think about that for a second. We're 2021. So you do the quick math, you're looking at 52 years. In the past 52 years, the federal government has run a deficit in 50 of those 52 years. And in recent years, that deficit is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, those deficits will then contribute to your national debt, and in theory, would hurt your credit rating and make it more difficult for the national government to borrow money. The fact of the matter is the federal government doesn't care a whole lot about that. And the federal government does a lot of counter-cyclical spending. And so we spend money even when we have a deficit at the national level. State and local levels, you're not able to do that. So the economic environment can have an impact upon the number and the types of policies that you are promulgating. The political environment, as we talked about before, is also very, very important for policy making. We already identified the polarization that exists between the two political parties. I'll give you another very famous scholar by the name of Aaron Wildavsky. And I don't know when you do any work in budgeting this program, if you read any Aaron Wildavsky, but Aaron Wildavsky is one of those heavyweights, or was one of those heavyweights in the world of public budgeting. And he had a very famous book out called The New Politics of the Budgeting Process. And the whole theme of that book was the increasing polarization of the budgeting process and how Democratic Party and Republican Party were going in completely opposite directions and making it more and more difficult to get budgets done on time and to get budgets done within the parameters of a balanced revenue and expenditure flow. That book was written way back in the 1980s, revised in the 1990s, and even then he was talking about this polarization. That polarization has become much broader today and much more dramatic today than it was even in Aaron Wildavsky's time. And again, one of the primary reasons, as I said, is because of gerrymandering and the creation of these safe districts. So now if you're from a safe district, you're from a safe Republican district in the House of Representatives, your primary concern is the primary itself, no pun intended. You're primarily concerned about getting primaried because you know that once you get to the general election, the Democrat's not going to provide any opposition to you because you're from such a conservative district. Your opposition is going to come in that primary from another Republican. So how do you combat that? By becoming even more conservative and moving even more to the right and even farther away from the Democrats. And Democrats are going to do the same thing and move farther away from Republicans. So when you have that polarization, it makes it difficult for you to get consensus and agreement on policies. Well, you would normally think we're a democracy. And so as a democracy, these people are being elected by citizens. And so citizens can hold them accountable. So if citizens don't like that, they think the policies are getting to be too liberal, or they think the policies are going to be too conservative, well, they'll vote the scoundrels out. Well, it's hard for them to do that because party labels are no longer reliable guides to be used in voting. In the past, when people would go into a voting booth, they would see Democrat and Republican, and they vote a straight Democratic ticket or they vote a straight Republican ticket. Party ID is not as strong today. And so people tend to cross over party lines. And so just because someone is a Democrat doesn't mean that they're going to support all the same policies. Or just because they're Republican, they're going to support all the same policies. Being able to vote based upon party affiliation of office holder is something known as responsible party theory, or RPT. RPT, or responsible party theory, was a major theory in political science a couple of decades ago. where people like Larry Sabato, you may see him on TV a lot. He's at the University of Virginia. He's all over TV during congressional elections and presidential elections. He was a big advocate of responsible party theory, where he said, we need to be able to hold people accountable to their party affiliation. That elected officials, if you're a Democrat, there need to be some mechanisms to make you vote Democratic while you're in Congress. If you're a Republican member, there need to be some punitive measures to keep you in line, to make sure you vote as a Republican. In order to do that, when you do that, then voters know who to hold accountable. That, well, I don't like these Democratic policies, so I'm going to vote for the Republican or vice versa. You have a lot of free agents who have now come into politics, where people who are independently wealthy do not need to work their way up the party machinery like they used to. In the past, if you wanted to be nominated for your party, you had to work your way up. And so you'd start working for candidates at the precinct level, become a precinct committee person, become a precinct chairperson, work your way up maybe to the county committee, then make your way up to the state committee. And that's how you worked your way up through the party until you could become a candidate. Now we have people who are independently wealthy that are not members of the party that just kind of swoop in and run for office. And having those free agents makes it a little bit more difficult for us to hold elected officials accountable according to their party affiliation. We've also seen the rise of third-party movements. And we've seen libertarian candidates and green candidates not winning national elections, but doing enough to influence the results of those national elections. And once you have those third-party movements, then again, that convolutes the process as well. Typically, those third-party movements don't last that long, in that if there's a third party, a splinter party, that actually becomes very popular, what happens? One of the major parties reabsorbs that splinter party. They'll say, this party's having a lot of success with this issue, so we are going to adopt their position on that issue. When the major party adopts the splinter party's position on an issue, there's no reason for the splinter party to exist anymore. And that splinter party then gets reabsorbed into one of the two major parties. Our system since the late 1700s has really been designed around a two political party system. When you have a two political party system, you have this natural divergence in terms of polarization, and it's that polarization that has really characterized the political environment of the policymaking process. So the social environment has an impact, the economic environment has an impact, the political environment has an impact, and the governing environment also has an impact. As we talked about before, we have a unique political system here in the United States where we fragment power across different levels of government and give different roles and responsibilities to national versus state versus local governments. We devolve a lot of power and a lot of authority down to the state level. And so you may have complications whereby you have a national policy that has certain national goals, but then the state administrators of that policy will have different goals on behalf of their states. And then local implementers will have their own goals. So this type of fragmentation of power means that we oftentimes lose focus in what we are trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it with our public policies. And then you overlay on top of that the cultural context. Every society has its own unique political culture. Here in the US, we have a different political culture than England has. We have a different political culture than China has or Russia has. So your unique political culture will then also have an impact upon your policies as compared to how those issues are addressed in other nations. A culture really speaks to the norms and the values and the expectations of a society. So here in the US, we have certain norms and values and expectations for our policy outcomes that may not be shared by our international counterparts. So you have to take into account the unique political culture in that country. You also have to realize that there are different political cultures across the United States, and different regions have different political cultures. Now, that's a little less true today than it used to be just because of the mobility of residents, and people are very mobile today compared to how immobile they were 50 or 60 years ago, but there still are different cultures across different parts of the country. Take the Southeast United States, for example. The Southeast United States has what's called a very traditional political culture. In that traditionalist political culture, they really do value the maintaining the status quo. So when you look from a policy perspective at which type of government is the most important for implementing a policy, in the Southeast, it's probably going to be the county. Counties in the Southeast do a lot of the jobs that cities tend to do in other parts of the country. The question is, well, why are counties so important? Because they've always been important. Because at the outset of the nation, it was the county that really was the seat of government in the Southeast. And so counties continue to be a primary player in the policy process in the Southeast because they have a very traditionalist type of political culture. Another type of political culture we see in the US is what's called an individualistic political culture. An individualistic political culture asks the question, what can I as an individual get out of government or get out of this policy? What benefits can I get from this policy? My participation in governance, my participation in policy making will be driven by my expectation of the benefits I get from that participation. So I participate out of my own rational self-interest. That's an individualistic type of political culture. There's also what's called a moralistic political culture. And a moralistic political culture, we oftentimes see that kind of in the Midwest, is you participate in policy making, you participate in governing, not because of what you can get out of it, but because it's a quote unquote right thing to do. And so you're going to be participating in policy making to benefit society and to benefit your community, irrespective of what individual thing you get out of it, or irrespective of how it was done in the past. And so individualistic, traditionalistic, moralistic, just examples of different types of political cultures we actually see within the United States. I lived in Florida for a year, and the old adage in Florida is if you go far enough south, you are north again. And the idea there is because you've had so many transplants from New England and from the Midwest that once you start going down to Miami or where I lived in Fort Myers or Naples, once you get that far south in the state, you've got a lot of Northerners who have transplanted down there and have brought their political cultures. So the middle of the state is a very traditionalist political culture. The southern part of the state is going to be a lot more individualistic because you brought a lot of people from the Northeast who have moved down there as snowbirds. And so you go far enough south, you're basically north again. And we've got that in a lot of states. And so we don't want to make it seem like there's one American political culture. There are multiple political cultures within the United States that will all have an impact upon the resulting public policies that we get. But we've just been talking a lot about public policies. We haven't really talked a lot about why they're public and why we consider them public as compared to private policies. And we also know in this country, one part of our kind of accepted culture is that we tend to defer to the private sector. We tend to say there are certain things that should be left to the private sector and certain things that should be done by government. In some of our European counterparts, they defer much less to the private sector. They have much less of this belief in what economists would call the invisible hand of the economy. But we do defer to the private sector for certain types of things. So we have certain public policies, but there are certain policies that are also then left to the private sector. So how do we determine what is a public policy, what has government involvement, versus what is a private policy and does not have government involvement? Well, we argue a lot about that. We argue a lot about the question of when should government become involved? When should this be a public as compared to a private policy? One reason for government involvement, political. It's politics, in that it makes political sense for government to be involved. And by government getting involved, it makes political sense for elected officials because they can then claim credit for it, and they can then get reelected as a response to that. And so sometimes there are political reasons for why we're involved. Again, this thing gets back to ideological differences between Democrats and Republicans and their inherent views of the proper role of government. Sometimes there are moral or ethical reasons in that we need to reduce healthcare disparities across different segments of our society. We need to make sure that civil rights and civil liberties are protected for all members of our communities. And so government gets involved for those moral and ethical reasons. To eliminate Jim Crow laws in the South, we saw the federal government get very involved in desegregation of schools and the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Employment Opportunity Act and all these movements by the federal government to make sure that people in southern states had their civil rights and liberties were protected, again, being done for those moral and for those ethical reasons. Sometimes we have government involvement, as you know, because of market failures. There are economic imperatives that make it necessary for government to get involved and make it necessary for these to be public as compared to private types of policies. Even though we do tend to defer to our capitalist market system, we do realize that at times the market will fail, and the market will fail for two main reasons. One, the market's unable to produce, it cannot produce a needed good or service, or it chooses not to produce the needed good or service. It chooses not to produce a needed good or service because it doesn't create a profit. If they don't have that bottom line, if it doesn't create a profit, there's no incentive for the private sector to engage in that. Sometimes logistically, it's impossible for the private sector to get involved in that provision and or production of that good or service. Everyday mail delivery would be very difficult for a FedEx or a UPS to get involved in that everyday mail delivery because of the logistical barriers to doing that. It would just be cost prohibitive for them to get involved in everyday mail delivery. So the market fails to provide or produce a good or service, then someone has to do it because we have to address that societal problem. And so that suggests for us a role of government. Government also tends to get involved not just because the market fails, but because of the presence of externalities or consequences. So when a good or service is being produced by the private sector and that results in pollution, that's a negative externality. It's a negative consequence. There's no incentive for that corporation to clean up that pollution. They don't get any profit by cleaning up the pollution. So government then comes in, and government comes in to clean up the pollution to reduce that negative externality. Some goods produce a positive externality. They produce a positive, a good consequence. And so sometimes government will get involved to subsidize the production of that good in order to to increase the amount of that positive externality. So they'll get involved in subsidies to create more of that positive externality. Positive externalities usually occur when we have free riders. So we have members of society who benefit from the production of this good, but they don't directly pay for consuming that good. If they're not paying for the consumption of that good, then the corporation will not take their demand into account because they're not getting any money for that demand. So government then comes in, subsidizes the production to allow these free riders to continue to get that positive externality. Public policies tend to come from pure public goods. And again, you've been introduced to this before, I know, but we usually talk about this typology of four different types of goods. There are pure public goods, there are pure private goods, and then in between those two extremes, you have what are called total goods and common pool goods. Pure public good is a good in which the government will provide and produce that good. Provision and production are two separate things. I've been saying provision and or production throughout our little discussion here, and I do that for a reason. Provision is when you give the resources to make production possible. So the tuition you pay for this program, that's provision of resources. It makes this program possible. Production is the actual creation of the output, the creation of the good or service. So what we are doing here on Friday, this is the production of that education. So we're using the resources through your tuition dollars to produce this education. In a pure public good, the government's probably going to do, or governments, plural, will do provision and production. So national defense is an example of a pure public good. It's a pure public good because we cannot exclude people from the benefits, and we also cannot exhaust it. It cannot be used up. So you cannot charge me a price for the benefit I get from national defense. I get that benefit. You can't charge me for the benefit I get. And the benefit I get does not erode the benefit you get. That I can benefit from national defense, you can still benefit from national defense. We both benefit at the same time. So it's non-excludable and it's non-exhaustible. That's a pure public good. And so those are the types of goods that we tend to see in our public policies. Opposite end of the spectrum, you have pure private goods. Pure private goods are excludable and they're exhaustible. So that candy bar in that convenience store is a pure private good. It's excludable in that if I don't pay the price for it, I don't get to consume that candy bar. You pay the price, you get to consume it. I've been excluded from consuming the candy bar. It's also exhaustible. If there's one on the shelf, you're faster than me, you get in there, you get it, you eat it, it's gone. We're rivals. It's a rivalrous type of good. And so it's been exhausted. That's a pure private good. The only real role for government to play there is in terms of regulation to make sure it's safe and to make sure that public safety is protected. In the middle area, the gray area, though, you have what are called total goods and common pool goods. And this is where you have a lot of argument about whether or not this should be a public or a private type of policy. Toll goods are like a toll road. They are excludable, but they are non-exhaustible. So you pull up on that toll road, you put your money in, the arm goes up, you drive on the toll road. If you don't put your money in, the arm stays down, you're excluded from driving on the toll road. So it's excludable, so it has that private sector type of component to it. But it's non-exhaustive in that everyone who pays eventually will be able to drive on that road. So it has a private element, but it also has a public element. That's what's called a toll good. And the opposite of a toll good is a common pool good. And a common pool good or common pool resource is just the opposite of a toll good in that it is non-excludable, but it is exhaustible. That you can't exclude people from getting the benefits of it, but once the benefits are gone, once it's used up, it's gone, and it's not available for anyone else to use. And so, mineral pools, mineral rights are good examples of common pool types of resources. Again, government gets involved in terms of regulating it. So if it's a common pool type of resource, we want to make sure everyone has access to it. But we do know it can be used up. So we might want to ration that access as much as we can to make sure that we can keep that resource alive. They can get involved in toll goods as well in order to make sure that even though there is a toll, we may want to, for people who don't have the financial wherewithal to pay that toll, we want to make sure that they can still get those staples of life. And so even though it's a toll good, we may want to have some programs to help people pay for utilities and things like that they need, even though they don't have the wherewithal to pay for them. So regardless, there's always some type of role for government. It's just the extent of that role. In a pure public good, it will be probably all government provision and production. And so falls within a pure type of public policy. When it has more private sector elements, that's going to be more of a regulatory policy as opposed to a pure public policy. So the type of good has an impact upon whether it's something that falls within a public policy or something that falls within the domain of the private sector. Clearly, the more things we consider to be public policies, the larger our public budgets become, the larger the scope of public policy analysis becomes. And at certain points in time, the federal government has categorized more things to be public goods than in the 1980s and 90s, started categorizing fewer things as public goods and allow for a lot more privatization, where the public sector would enter into contracts with the private sector to allow the private sector to produce the good, and then government would pay for the contract through the provision function. So again, the amount that's public versus private will depend upon how we categorize and how we define those goods that are being provided and those goods that are being produced. In policy analysis, though, we base our decisions upon evidence. This is a very empirical exercise that we engage in policy analysis. And when we call something empirical, something becomes empirical when you can sense it, when it's something that is tangible, it's something that can be sensed. So it's an empirical type of endeavor for us, where we will go out there and collect tangible evidence, use that tangible evidence in a systemic way in order to arrive at conclusions about our policies, to arrive at conclusions about how effective or how efficient our policies are. But make no mistake, policy analysis over the past several years has become much more of an evidence-based, much more of an empirical type of endeavor. Citizens, when they do policy analysis, it's not quite as evidence-based, it's not quite as empirical. It's more, again, from the perspective of what can I get out of this policy? What benefits can I get from this policy? But we as professional policy analysts, we're going to take that much more empirical, much more evidence-based, much more systemic approach to how we study all the different elements of the public policy process. And our goal then is to take all this evidence, take all this empirical information, analyze it, and use it to draw conclusions about our policies and decide whether or not this is a policy that needs to be continued. So hopefully the outcome of our policy analysis will actually have an impact upon the decisions made by elected officials about which policies to fund and which policies to continue. In public policy analysis, we have several criteria that we use to analyze our policies through this empirical systemic process. One of them is efficiency, which again is very similar to what a private corporation would do with its private policies. It's more the more with less type of attitude, that we look at the inputs that we're putting into this policy and we compare it to the outputs. Are we getting the outputs that we want with the inputs that we are putting into this policy? So a pure efficiency type of perspective. That's one criteria we can use. But we go beyond the private sector as well because we add on other criteria. So in addition to efficiency, a second criteria we usually look at is effectiveness. So we go beyond just the output that we are creating and comparing that to the input like we would do with efficiency, and we start to look at outcomes. And we ask the question, what are the consequences of this policy? Is this policy having its desired outcome? Is it having its desired consequences for the beneficiaries that should be gaining a benefit from participation in this policy? So effectiveness is a second criteria we tend to use. In the public sector, we also look at a third criteria, equity. And so we look at how equitable the policy is. Are people being treated in an equitable manner? Are all segments of our society benefiting from this policy and benefiting in an equitable way? This is the rise of social equity as one of the major values in the discipline of public administration. So equity is another criteria that we will use. And then the fourth criteria is political feasibility, where we will ask the question, not only is this policy efficient, effective, and equitable, but is it politically feasible? Does it make political sense? Is it something that members of Congress or members of the state legislature in both parties can get behind and support? If it's possible that policy could be efficient, could be effective, could be equitable, but it lacks political feasibility. And if it lacks political feasibility, it's probably not going to happen. In my budgeting class, I always tell people, well, my favorite phrases in budgeting is that political imperatives trump economic imperatives. And again, I've been saying that for years, long before Donald Trump was ever a president, but political imperatives trump economic imperatives. That a policy could make a great deal of economic sense. You know, it can make a great deal of sense from an efficiency perspective, but if it does not make political sense, it probably is not going to happen. We always need to understand that policies get made, policies get implemented within this political environment. We always have to be sensitive to this political environment It's kind of similar to what Woodrow Wilson told us way back in 1887 in his Study of Administration piece, where he said that politics are the touchstone of administration. Well, I would argue politics are also the touchstone of public policies. We always have to be sensitive to the political environment when we are analyzing or implementing a public policy. As we move throughout this class, we are always going to have that duality that we are going to be dealing with. We're going to be dealing with the science of policy analysis, which are the methods and the nuts and bolts of policy analysis. But we're also going to be dealing with the art of policy analysis. And the art of policy analysis is the politics, the political context. And so to be an adept policy analyst, you need to master both the science of policy analysis as well as the art, the politics of policy analysis. And if you can master both of those parts of the equation, that's how you become a successful policy analyst. So that's kind of our foundational information to get us going. Again, just kind of define policy analysis, know why we are doing policy analysis, what public problems are, proper role of government versus the private sector in addressing these quote unquote societal problems. Again, just kind of give us this even playing field and this footing that we can all move forward with. So, and I talked a lot so far in the past 2 hours, I apologize, but do you have any questions about any of this foundational information? I don't want to keep you here all day, so I could talk more and I won't. Any questions about any of the foundational information just to kind of get us going? Okay, if not, then I would say let's call it quits for right now. It's a couple hours of me talking and my voice is already kind of gone. But when we get back together on Friday, we will move forward talking about more about the actors and the institutions involved in the policymaking process. And then again, remember for Friday by midnight, you have your first paper that is due where you identify your societal problem and all those good things. Then you also have your first Canvas essay that is due along with the 2 responses to colleagues. If you can have all that turned in by midnight next Friday, that would be great. We'll be back at it on Friday at 8:30 bright and early. We'll see how long it takes us. I imagine probably about 3 hours or so class. I think will probably be sufficient. And do the heavy lifting we need to do on Friday. If you have any questions at all about any of this material, any questions at all about the syllabus or the course requirements or your societal problem you want to use, by all means, again, email me and I'm happy to provide you with any feedback or answer any questions you may have. Otherwise, thanks for being here and getting us started and get another class together. And we'll be back at it again next Friday. Sound good? Okay. Nice seeing everyone. Thanks again. And I'll see you again on Friday. Take care, everybody.